Hey, what's going on, everybody? Now for the fun part. We're going to go ahead and get ready to pour. I'm going to show you how to prep the actual wood now that we have it sealed, and how to set the mold up and get everything level before we actually go ahead and pour. Stick around. All right, now that we have our wood and our mold, we need to go ahead and secure the wood itself to the mold, so that way, one, it doesn't float up, it doesn't create a void underneath where epoxy is going to escape to. And then lastly, just making sure that the wood stays where you want it to. If you might have a loose piece in there for a design that you're going for, but if it's not secured, it's going to move on you. So the way to do that is, there's a couple different ways, but the way that I'm going to go ahead and do it is just use a couple of blocks, make sure they're wrapped in Tyvek tape or packaging tape. Otherwise, it's going to be a permanent piece of your actual cutting board or whatever you're making. Just go ahead and set them on there, and then grab a piece of scrap wood, which is what I'm doing. Again, there's a couple different ways to do this. You can use clamps, scrap wood. They've got a lot of plastic molds that have pieces that go across that move, which are pretty cool, but they're also extremely expensive. But this is just scrap wood, so anybody can do this. And all we're going to go ahead and now is just go ahead and attach it. Again, it just secure it. You don't have to crank down on it, so that way it's breaking your supports. Just a little bit of pressure down is going to hold it where it needs to be at. Okay, now that we've got the wood secured inside the mold, the last thing that we need to do before we get ready to pour, and another really important piece of this, so you're not wasting epoxy or causing your cutting board or whatever you're working on to come out misshapen, and not the way that you want to, also wasting epoxy. All right, it needs to be level. Epoxy is self-leveling, so if it's lower on one side or in a corner, epoxy is going to pull to that end and it's going to leave you with a void on the opposite end. So right now you can look at my piece. We'll go ahead and zoom in, and you can see that it's not level, so we're going to go ahead and try to correct that real quick using some shims. Now we're level there. We also have to check it the other way as well. So go ahead and zoom out here. All right, now we're going to go ahead and check the other side. We'll go ahead and zoom in here. And you can see that it's off as well, so we're going to go ahead and fix that too. Good there, and then I'm just going to go ahead and double check the other side, make sure we're still good. All right, and we're good. Okay, specifically for this board I'm doing, it's black walnut, and it's just about 1.5 inches thick. It's going to be plain down, so something I need to consider, because it's going to be a two-tone. There's going to be a base pour that I'm using, this black diamond pigment. It's solid black, so I'm going to want it really, really dark. All right, so that's going to get poured in first. I need to have a line that I'm going to actually pour to, so I don't pour too much into it. And that's what I have this blue tape on here. So I'm going to pour into the bottom of that blue line. I don't need a lot of black in there, but the reason I'm pouring it a little bit more than you may need is because this has to get run through a planer to flatten the bottom and the top. And if I don't put enough in there, and I put these casings in here, and if it sits almost at the bottom when I run it through my planer, it's going to chew up my planer blade. So if you try to do something like this where you're adding brass casings or something to your pour, just make sure you keep that in mind. They need to float in the middle. So the way this is going to work is, I'm going to pour black in here first. I'm basically going to let it sit up till it's tacky. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to use these casings, and I'm going to orient them in here how I want to, making sure they're clean and there's no debris on them. And then once they're set where I want them to, then I'm going to come back once the black epoxy is completely cured with a clear coat, and I'm going to pour over that nice and slow, so that way the epoxy will get into all these nooks and crannies of the casings, so that way it doesn't have a whole lot of air bubbles. And then I'll pour it all the way up to the top. So this is going to be like a 2 or 3 day process. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and mix up my epoxy. I'm using Super Clear's tabletop epoxy. It's a 1-to-1 mix, and I'm using these measuring cups from Home Depot. I know Super Clear, I'm pretty sure they have their own. But as long as it has a 1-to-1 ratio mix on it, and it's kind of hard to see. There we go. You just want to make sure it has that chart in there for you to use. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is go ahead. It doesn't matter which one you pour. Just remember to look at the right chart when you're pouring it in. So this cup in particular, it goes up to 4, it's 1-to-1 ratio, but it goes up to 4 parts, and 4 parts is the most you can put in here. That's probably about what I'll need. All right, now that I have my mixture in here, all right, I'm going to go ahead and use my Black Diamond epoxy, or my Black Diamond pigment from Black Diamond Pigments, and this is really cool. I almost always put way more pigment than needed, but this is going to be black, and I want it really dark to get that brass from the casings that pop. So for this one in particular, I'm putting in 1 full tablespoon, and then we're going to go ahead and mix it up. All right, something to keep in mind too is when you're mixing these up, just get yourself a paddle mixer. If you're going to continue to use the same one for a while, just make sure it's dry and there's no other pigment that's going to get off on here. But go slow. You don't need to fly through this. If you go way too fast and mix it up too fast, you're going to introduce a ton of air into this, and over the 24-hour period, not all the air will escape, and it'll look foamy, or there'll be a ton of bubbles in it, and that's not what you want to happen. So just take your time mixing it. Just make sure you have something that you can let your paddle actually hang over so you don't get your epoxy everywhere. Just take your time doing this too. You don't need to dump it in super fast. The faster you dump this in, the more air bubbles that are introduced, and that's never a good thing with epoxy. So right now I'm basically at my line. I'm gonna let it sit for a second, because there are some cracks along the side where the wood, there's a little bit gap between the wall and the wood itself. It will eventually pull off to the side a little bit. So I'm gonna let it sit for a minute. And that's pretty much it. All right, so some of the smaller bubbles, it's just the epoxy off-gassing to get the air out. But if you have large bubbles that come up, just hit it with a heat gun really quick, or a torch very quickly, just to pop it and just let it continue to self-level and cure. You don't want to stay on it with constant heat, because I've actually done that before in the past, and it created like almost an iceberg of solid epoxy, because it overheated it and it was like floating in the middle. It ended up turning out fine, but it could be catastrophic if you're doing a bigger pour. So just keep that in mind. And now we wait. I have all the brass casings already inlaid where I want them to. They're adhered, so they're not going to move around on me. I'm just going to go ahead and pour this clear epoxy over top to give that glass look. But I'm doing it really slow, so that way it fills in all the nooks and crannies and doesn't create a lot of air bubbles. But once I'm complete with this, I'm just going to go ahead and let it set up for 24 hours, and then we'll get ready to plane it and finish it. Thanks for watching, everybody.